The following video was brought to you by Audible, where you can download a free audiobook by visiting audible.com/bunnyhop. With audiobooks, you can get your reading done while cleaning, exercising, or even playing video games. Because MMOs don't have music. So this time, I want to recommend Masters of Doom by David Kushner, and read by Will Wheaton. This is a must-read piece if you're into the history, the culture, the business, or even the journalism of video games. It's an interview-fueled retrospective written kind of like a novel, a lot of dramatic flair exaggerating up what was a pretty dramatic time. If you don't learn a thing or two, you'll at least have fun trying to learn a thing or two, and that's the whole idea of this show. So, with that being said, let's get started. The Trans-Pacific Partnership has a lot of people scared shitless these days, for some silly and some justified reasons that I'm gonna aim to clear up here. Note that I do not personally approve of the measures that this or many other free trade agreements aim to take, but I also see a lot of doomsday prophesizing that's rooted less in fact-based research of the news and more in hypothetical worst-case scenarios thought up by the authors themselves. And since I don't want to be a super negative, angry, inflammatory YouTube channel, unless it's about streaming or hype culture, I decided to actually look into the issue and see if it's worth ending my happiness over. It's maybe. So let's start by answering the first and the most simple question. What is the Trans-Pacific Partnership? The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a proposed free trade agreement drafted by a lot of nations that have coasts along the Pacific Ocean. It was drafted way back in 2008 when the US entered into trade negotiations with New Zealand, Austria, Chile, Peru, and later on Mexico, Canada, Japan, and basically everyone else on this list. Like previous free trade agreements, it's essentially a document listing obligations that all the participating nations agree are good obligations to have. Unlike the previous ones, though, this is the biggest one by a huge margin. The idea behind free trade is to reduce tariffs, which are taxes on exports and imports, to encourage commercial development and competition by making it cheaper for international companies to do business with one another. They also serve as a way of creating and standardizing the rules by which countries do that business, with one of the stated aims of the TPP being to establish higher standards for workplace conditions, environmental issues, and rights management in all the participating nations to hopefully improve conditions in those participating nations. That's the idea, and another more implicit idea is that free trade will also serve a purpose as a political ploy. Barack Obama has been pushing the TPP so hard, partially because he sees it as a way to spread America's sphere of influence further into China's territory, establishing rules for trade in many Asian economies on America's terms rather than China's. Free trade agreements pick and choose which products get what kind of tariffs, with the ultimate assumption being that less tariffs overall mean a more free marketplace, where price, quality, and consumer preference will decide the dominant products rather than the ones that have the home field advantage, which is the purpose that tariffs have historically served. But that's exactly where the common criticism of neoliberalism or globalization or whatever you want to call the free trade agreements of the 90s and the following deregulation of the global market comes from. Because it creates a situation where wealthier corporations can afford to outsource cheap labor and export cheap goods, which is something that doesn't benefit most people of either country, rather than just the small minority of business elites who are the ones who directly profit from the actual importing and exporting going on. An easy example of the moral problems that free trade present is, let's say, clothing in Africa. One of the reasons you see so many pictures of poor African people wearing t-shirts of last year's Super Bowl losers is because they were donated over there from charitable organizations from the West for free, and the African textile industries, which were actually pretty strong up until the 1980s, couldn't compete with free. Jobs were lost, revenue wasn't being made, and poverty spread alongside donated clothes. Bring that same problem closer to home and you get the contentious issue of dairy products in Canada. Canada's been really leery about participating in the TPP, and one of the reasons why is because the dairy lobby has been fighting hard to maintain the country's historically high tariff on milk. The assumption being that lowering that to introduce foreign milk trucked in from the US will have local farmers losing business, which will result in lost revenue made by Canadian farmers, selling to Canadian retailers and circulating money through the supply chain of the overall Canadian economy. But what does this have to do with video games? The answer is that probably the most controversial problem with this agreement precisely has to do with the broadness of this agreement, of why the price of milk in Canada would have anything to do with video games. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is an all-or-nothing affair. The document was drafted in secret over the past 7 years to be publicly released on today. Now it's available for public review in Congress for 60 days before the U.S. International Trade Commission reviews it for 105 days before the House and Senate make up their minds on voting for it for 90 days. And before this process has begun, the video game industry has already voiced its support for it. The Entertainment Software Association released a statement commending the TPP, and if you ever turn a video game console upside down and look at the labels, you'll see why they absolutely have no reason not to. Importing electronic parts from the cheapest source possible saves the game industry money. Although games are developed in expensive cities like San Francisco, Montreal, and Tokyo, when it comes time to print tangible physical products off an assembly line, a whole lot of what makes a game console comes from somewhere much, much cheaper. Like it or not, video games might be a few dollars more expensive if that wasn't the case, and the industry doesn't want that. And to further keep costs low and maintain the status quo, the ESA is going to lobby for this thing while it's making its way through the lawmaking process, which also means they'll be lobbying for intellectual property laws that are also going to maintain the status quo, which is why video games have something to do with the price of milk in Canada. Laws governing the creation and protection of new video game ideas, the punishments for breaking video game DRM, and video game region locks, and the extension of the American standard of a video game's copyright period, which is now the life of the original author plus 70 years, are all amendments of the TPP that any participating nations will have to agree to. Whether or not they actually enforce them is a more complicated matter that's kind of contradicted in the documentation itself, but before they figure that out, lawmakers can't alter the agreement at all while it's in Congress. It's either a yes or a no, an all or nothing on new trade policies that affect global intellectual property rights on the internet, on the same documents that adjust dairy import prices for Canada. The leaked release of the TPP's intellectual property chapter on October 9th got critics revved up to pick this thing apart, because what's inside are rules stating that any person who engages willfully in circumventing rights management measures is subject to their country's criminal court proceedings. Internet service providers are to be given legal incentives to shut down websites that copyright holders suspect of having violating content. An internet service provider that removes or disables access to that material shall be exempt from any liability for having done so. Countries should provide statutory secondary liability for copyright infringement when a person provides a service primarily for the purpose of enabling acts of copyright infringement, which, to these people, that is what YouTube looks like to them. It looks like a service primarily for copyright infringement. That's exactly the picture Viacom wanted to paint in their lawsuit back in 2007. Anyways, it also says that these countries aren't technically obligated to put in place judicial systems for the enforcement of intellectual property rights before it goes on for pages and pages about exactly what a system like that would look like and how it would work. And for all the care and attention they're giving to cracking down on DRM and copyright violations, almost no care and attention was paid to the trade secrets section, which just mentions that countries should ensure that companies have the legal means to prevent secrets from getting out by others without their permission, which is literally just a few lines that states that and pretty much only that. This is the whole thing. And the picture it paints is broad, very broad, and also not how the world works. I had to deal with this exact same problem earlier this year. Competing businesses stealing secrets is one thing, but what about journalists or whistleblowers reporting on corporate wrongdoing? That's usually the much more relevant cases of that happening. This whole section is so quick and simple, and then it's over, and then that's it. Plus, that's a serious incompatibility with current US law, and what's been set as a precedent time and time again. You're seriously stepping on First Amendment territory with this thing. It's something that would never fly for a day in court. And how exactly is cracking down on company leaks related to free trade again? What do you have to worry about? Realistically speaking, if you're clearly understanding the English I'm speaking and watching this on your own private internet connection in your own home, you're probably not going to have to worry about life getting a hell of a lot worse. But only because these leaked plans are a much more extreme language for how things already work right now. A company can issue a DMCA takedown and have content removed at their very whim. Whether or not it actually violates copyright is an issue tackled after the victims already lost some business. And the idea of criminalizing random kids for pirating software or circumventing region locks one day just by themselves would seem ridiculous. Until you remember the campaign of the 18,000 John Doe lawsuits that the RIAA filed against random individuals for 9 years. But some fears you see floating around, like console region locking being mandated, is ridiculous. Same deal with criminalizing YouTubers for not using watermarks in their images, or cosplayers being arrested for dressing up as characters. The sections of the leaked chapters in question don't mention watermarks, there's nothing in there forcing devices to be region locked, and you have to keep in mind that a lot of fan derivative works, like say ad-supported YouTube videos, already exist in a legal gray area that companies could regulate but typically don't, both because of the negative PR of such a move and the legitimate legality of what a lot of fans do. But the biggest issue I see here is a push for American standards of copyright law being applied overseas, because the American standard of copyright law is ridiculous. Something as ubiquitous and profitless as, say, a cartridge ROM dump of Pong for the Atari 2600 is not likely to go into the public domain until most people watching this video are dead and buried. With the public release of the TPP comes a painful media push and the typically long and argumentative process of getting laws passed through Congress. And with the full documentation now available, politicians and people alike will be rifling through it and making a scene about it, because this also happens to be an election season. Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Donald Trump have all voiced their opposition to this deal, but since it's kind of Obama's baby and set to be voted on before he leaves the White House, they're not likely to matter. What you can do until then is talk to your politicians and hold them accountable. Now that the TPP is no longer secret and has gone public, it'll be very interesting to see where this debate goes over the next few weeks, and just how much it'll have to do with video games after all.
The new electronic interdependence recreates the world in the image of a global village.